I arrived at the Blackwood cabin on the final morning of the year, seeking nothing but the heavy silence of the snow and a clean break from a world that felt far too loud. The cabin was a rustic, two-story structure tucked deep into a valley where the cell service died 5 miles back on the main road, making it the perfect place for a week of isolation. I had spent the afternoon chopping wood and settling in, watching the sun dip behind the jagged treeline while the temperature plummeted into the negatives. By 10 p.m., I was curled up by the fireplace with a book, the only sound being the occasional pop of the pine logs and the low, rhythmic whistling of the wind against the cedar siding. The peace was absolute, or at least it was until a heavy, insistent knocking began at the front door, echoing through the hollow wooden house like a heartbeat. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, because there was no reason for anyone to be out in this wilderness on a night when the roads were considered impassable. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see a man standing on the porch, his face illuminated by the flickering yellow light of the outdoor lantern. He looked exhausted, his breath coming in thick plumes of steam, and he was wearing a vintage hunting jacket that looked decades out of style. When I opened the door just a crack, he didn't try to push his way in, but instead he leaned against the frame and told me that his car had slid into the ravine a mile up the trail. He claimed he had lived in this cabin years ago and asked if he could just come in to warm up while he waited for the morning light to trek back to the main road. There was something off about the way he said the word retrieve, mentioning that he had left a personal item hidden under the floorboards during his last stay and he felt the need to get it tonight. I told him I wasn't comfortable letting a stranger in, but I offered to bring him a blanket and some hot coffee to the porch. His expression shifted instantly, the faux politeness vanishing into a cold, hard stare that made me regret opening the door even an inch. He told me that it was a matter of life and death, and that the item in the house didn't belong to me, nor did it belong to the people who were currently renting the property. I slammed the door and turned the deadbolt, my hands shaking as I watched his shadow move across the frosted glass of the side window. He didn't leave. Instead, he began to walk around the perimeter of the cabin, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen crust of the snow. I went to the kitchen to grab the heavy iron poker from the hearth, but as I passed the pantry, I heard a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It wasn't coming from outside the house, but from directly beneath my feet, coming from the small, cramped crawl space that served as a cellar. It was a slow, methodical scratching, as if someone was trying to unscrew the floorboards from the underside. I realized with a jolt of pure dread that the man at the door was just a distraction, and that there was someone else already inside the foundations of the house. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the man outside start to hum a low, tuneless melody while the scratching below me grew louder and more frantic. Why would someone go to such lengths to enter a remote cabin on New Year's Eve? And what could possibly be hidden beneath the wood that was worth a home invasion? I remembered the owner mentioning a hidden trapdoor under the rug in the hallway, and I moved toward it, my breath held tight in my chest. I moved the heavy wool rug aside and saw that the wooden latch was already vibrating, the screws being pushed upward by a pry bar from the darkness below. I grabbed the heavy oak dining chair and shoved it over the trapdoor, the weight of the furniture slamming down just as the wood began to splinter. A muffled curse came from the cellar, followed by a violent thud as the person below tried to shoulder the door open against the weight of the chair. Outside, the man on the porch heard the commotion and began to hammer on the front door with a heavy object, the wood beginning to crack under the force of his blows. I was trapped between 2 points of entry, with no way to call for help and no neighbors for miles to hear my screams. I ran to the back mudroom, hoping to find a way out through the small window, but I saw the silhouette of a third person standing by the treeline, holding a long, thin object that could only be a rifle. This wasn't a random coincidence. This was a coordinated effort to reclaim something the cabin was hiding in its bones. The man at the front door finally broke through the upper panel, his gloved hand reaching through the shattered wood to fledge for the internal lock. I swung the iron poker with every bit of strength I possessed, striking his arm and hearing the satisfying crack of bone, which bought me a few more seconds of life. He roared in pain and retreated, but the person in the cellar was now using a saw, the jagged metal teeth biting through the floorboards right next to the chair legs. I realized that the house was no longer a sanctuary, but a sieve that was leaking safety from every corner. I ran up the stairs to the second-floor loft, dragging a heavy dresser to the top of the landing to create a makeshift barricade. From the loft, I could see the entire living room, and I watched as the trapdoor finally gave way, a man dressed in black tactical gear climbing out of the darkness of the earth. He didn't look like a common thief. He looked like someone who was paid to make people disappear. He looked up at me, his eyes hidden behind a dark mask, and he signaled to the man at the broken front door to enter. They met in the center of the room, whispering in hushed tones while they ignored the pain of their injuries, their focus entirely on the space beneath the floorboards where the trapdoor had been. They began to tear up the remaining planks, ignoring me for the moment as if I were already dead and just didn't know it yet. I watched from above as they pulled a heavy, metallic case from a hidden compartment in the joists, a case that was covered in decades of dust and grime. One of them checked the seal and nodded, and for a heartbeat, I thought they might just leave me there and disappear into the night with their prize. But the man from the porch looked up at the loft, his eyes filled with a cruel, lingering malice that told me they couldn't leave any witnesses behind. He began to climb the stairs, his boots heavy on the wood, while the man with the case headed for the door to secure their escape. I looked around the loft for any means of defense, and my eyes landed on the heavy, decorative elk antlers mounted on the wall. As the first man reached the top of the stairs and began to push against the dresser, I gripped the antlers and prepared to fight for my life in the flickering shadows of the dying fire. I knew that the transition into the new year was happening at that very moment, the silent forest outside indifferent to the violence unfolding within the cabin walls. I waited until his head cleared the top of the dresser, his hand reaching for his belt, and I lunged forward with the only weapon I had left. The struggle was a blur of heavy breathing and the smell of old wood, a desperate scramble for survival where every second felt like a lifetime. I managed to shove the dresser down the stairs, sending the man tumbling back into the living room in a chaotic mess of limbs and broken furniture. I didn't wait to see if he was moving. I climbed out onto the exterior balcony and leaped into the deep snowdrift below, the cold shocking my system and momentarily stealing my breath. I scrambled to my feet and ran into the darkness of the woods, the white world swallowing me whole as I heard the angry shouts echoing from the cabin behind me. I didn't stop running until the lights of the house were nothing more than a faint, orange glow in the distance, a reminder of the night that the past came back to claim its due. I sat in the hollow of an old oak tree, watching the stars and waiting for the sun to rise on a year that I had nearly lost before it even began. The office was a graveyard of dead dreams and unfinished spreadsheets, and I was the only soul left to witness the transition into a year I wasn't even sure I wanted to see. I was sitting on the 42nd floor of the Sterling building, a glass and steel monolith that felt more like a tomb as the city below erupted in distant, muffled celebrations. My boss had made it clear that the year-end audit had to be finalized before the clock struck 12. Or I wouldn't have a desk to come back to on January 2nd. I was leaning back in my ergonomic chair, rubbing my eyes until I saw stars, when the steady hum of the building's ventilation system suddenly cut out, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I looked at my computer screen, but the monitor had gone black, and the emergency lights didn't kick in like they were supposed to, leaving me in a world of deep shadows and the cold, blue light of the moon reflecting off the frosted windows. I stood up, the wheels of my chair squeaking like a scream in the quiet office, and I walked toward the elevator bank, thinking it was just a localized power failure. I pressed the call button repeatedly, but the brass plate remained dark, and when I pressed my ear against the heavy metal doors, I didn't hear the usual whirring of cables, but rather the sound of heavy, rhythmic hammering coming from the shaft below. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the sound of metal meeting metal with a purposeful, violent intent that made my heart skip a beat. I realized then that the elevators hadn't just failed. They had been manually deactivated from the main control room in the basement, effectively turning the 42nd floor into a high-altitude cage. I reached for my cell phone to call security, but I found that there was absolutely no signal, which was impossible for a building in the heart of the downtown district. I walked to the edge of the glass, looking down at the street level where the tiny figures of revelers were blowing horns and dancing, completely unaware that someone was being systematically isolated 40 stories above their heads. I turned back toward the dark expanse of the cubicle farm, and that was when I saw it. A small red laser dot dancing across the surface of my mahogany desk. The dot moved from the desk to my chest, hovering right over my heart, and I dove behind a filing cabinet just as the glass pane behind me shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. There was no sound of a gunshot, only the whistling of the wind rushing through the new hole in the building, which meant whoever was out there was using a suppressed weapon and was likely perched on the rooftop of the shorter building across the street. I crawled on my hands and knees through the maze of desks, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps as I tried to process why anyone would be targeting a low-level auditor on New Year's Eve. I reached the stairwell door and pulled on the handle, but it was locked from the outside, a safety violation that should have been impossible but was now a death sentence. I heard the heavy clack of the service stairs door opening at the far end of the floor, and the sound of heavy boots stepping onto the carpeted floor echoed through the open space. There were at least 3 of them, and they weren't talking. They were moving with a synchronized precision that told me they had done this many times before. I peeked around the corner of a partition and saw the beams of their high-powered flashlights cutting through the darkness, scanning the floor for any sign of movement. They weren't looking for files or money. They were clearing the floor, and I was the only variable they hadn't accounted for in their plan. I realized that the audit I was working on must have contained something far more dangerous than simple accounting errors, and someone wanted to make sure that data never saw the light of the new year. I retreated further into the darkness of the executive wing, where the offices were larger and offered more places to hide, but also more dead ends that could trap me. I found myself in the CEO's corner suite, a room filled with heavy furniture and a massive, walk-in safe that was currently standing half open. I slipped inside the safe, pulling the heavy door nearly shut but leaving a tiny crack so I wouldn't suffocate, and I watched through the sliver of light as the beams of the flashlights entered the room. I could hear them breathing now, a low and steady sound that made my skin crawl, and one of them stopped just inches from the safe door. He was so close I could smell the faint scent of rain and gun oil on his clothes, and I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. "He's not here," a voice whispered, the tone cold and professional, devoid of any hesitation or mercy. "Check the server room again." He couldn't have gone far with the elevators and stairs locked down from the master switch. I heard them move away, their footsteps fading as they headed toward the data center at the core of the building, and I knew I only had a few minutes before they circled back. I stepped out of the safe, my legs feeling like lead, and I realized my only hope was to reach the maintenance hatch that led to the window washing platform outside. It was a terrifying prospect, being suspended hundreds of feet in the air during a winter storm, but it was the only exit they hadn't yet secured. I made my way toward the utility closet, my eyes adjusting to the darkness just enough to avoid the debris on the floor, and I found the ladder leading up to the roof hatch. As I climbed, I could hear them returning to the suite, their voices rising in frustration as they realized I was slipping through their fingers. I pushed the hatch open, and the freezing night air hit me like a physical blow, the wind howling around the corners of the skyscraper with a ferocity that threatened to knock me off my feet. I scrambled onto the roof, the gravel crunching under my shoes, and I saw the window washing rig swaying dangerously in the gusts. I climbed into the metal basket, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the control lever, and I began the slow, agonizing descent down the side of the building. I was halfway between the 42nd and 41st floors when the hatch above me flew open, and the man with the suppressed rifle leaned out, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the weapon and began to fire, the bullets thudding into the metal frame of the basket and sending sparks flying into the night sky. I ducked low, pressing my body against the cold floor of the rig, and I pulled the emergency release lever, praying that the secondary brakes would hold. The basket dropped 10 feet in a sudden, sickening jolt that nearly threw me over the side, but it put me out of the direct line of sight of the shooter for a brief moment. I watched the windows of the building as I slid past, seeing the empty offices and the festive decorations that now looked like a cruel joke. I reached the 30th floor, and I saw a maintenance worker through the glass. his back turned as he changed a light bulb, completely oblivious to the man clinging to a swaying metal box outside his window. I hammered on the glass, screaming for help, but the triple-pane soundproofing was too thick, and he simply packed up his tools and walked out of the room, turning off the lights behind him. The rig shuddered again as the men on the roof began to cut the primary cables, and I felt the basket tilt at a terrifying angle as one side gave way. I was dangling by a single steel thread, swinging in the wind like a pendulum, while the city below continued to celebrate the arrival of a new year. I looked up and saw the cable fraying, the individual strands of wire snapping one by one with a sharp ping that echoed over the sound of the wind. I had to jump to the nearest ledge, a narrow concrete outcropping that looked no wider than a book, or I would fall with the rig when the final strand gave way. I stood on the edge of the tilting basket, my heart roaring in my ears, and I waited for the rig to swing toward the building one last time. As the metal frame brushed against the concrete, I leaped, my fingers clawing at the rough surface as the basket plummeted into the darkness below, crashing into a dumpster 40 stories down with a sound like a bomb going off. I hung there, my feet dangling in the void, watching the men on the roof peer over the edge to see if I had fallen with it. I pulled myself onto the narrow ledge, pressing my back against the cold glass, wondering how long I could hold on before the cold took my strength, or before they found the service door that led to the ledge. I wasn't supposed to be working the register at the Oak Haven gas station on New Year's Eve, but money has a way of making you say yes to things that your gut tells you to avoid. The station is a lonely, fluorescent island sitting right on the edge of a national forest, miles away from the nearest town and even further from any kind of help if things go sideways. By 11 p.m., the blizzard had turned the world outside into a thick, swirling wall of white, effectively cutting me off from the rest of civilization while the rest of the world was busy popping champagne and making promises they wouldn't keep. I sat behind the bulletproof glass, which always felt more like a cage than a shield, watching the digital clock on the wall tick toward midnight while the wind howled through the gaps in the door frames. The silence of the forest was broken by the low, rhythmic rumble of an engine that didn't sound like it belonged to a standard commuter car. A rusted, charcoal gray van pulled into the lot, bypassing the pumps entirely and parking in the deepest shadows just beyond the reach of the overhead lights. My heart gave a sharp, uncomfortable tug in my chest when the engine cut out, but no one stepped out of the vehicle for a full 5 minutes. I found myself staring at the dark windshield, wondering if the driver was watching me back, or if they were preparing something in the cramped space of that windowless van. When the door finally creaked open, a tall man in a heavy, grease-stained canvas coat stepped out, his face obscured by a low-hanging baseball cap and a scarf pulled tight against the biting cold. He didn't walk toward the door with the stride of someone looking for fuel or snacks, but instead moved with a slow, predatory deliberation that made the hair on my arms stand up. When he entered, the bell above the door gave a lonely, tinny ring that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the small, cramped aisles of the store. He didn't look at me, nor did he head for the coolers, but instead began to walk the perimeter of the room, dragging his hand along the shelves and knocking small items to the floor as he went. I cleared my throat, trying to find a voice that didn't shake, and asked him if he needed help finding something, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking, his boots heavy and wet on the linoleum, creating a trail of melting snow that looked like a path leading straight to where I was sitting. Why was he ignoring me so completely, and why did he feel the need to touch every single exit and window lock as he passed them? He eventually stopped at the very back of the store, near the locked door that leads to the storage basement, and he just stood there with his back to me for a long time. I realized then that I couldn't hear the hum of the refrigerator anymore, and a quick glance at the control panel showed me that the external power lines must have been tampered with. The only thing keeping the lights on was the emergency generator, and I knew from experience that it only had enough fuel to last another hour at most. I reached for the landline under the counter, but the dial tone was replaced by a flat, hollow silence that told me the wires had been cut outside in the storm. The man finally turned around, and though his face was still partially shadowed, I could see that he was holding a small, black device that looked like a signal jammer. He took a step toward the counter, his eyes fixed on mine with a flat, emotionless intensity that made me feel like I was already a ghost. He didn't pull a weapon, at least not yet, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a Polaroid photograph, sliding it through the small gap in the bulletproof glass. My blood turned to ice when I looked down and saw a picture of myself, taken from outside through the very window I was currently sitting behind. The photo was dated from 3 hours ago, meaning he had been sitting in the dark, watching me, long before I ever noticed his van in the lot. "The power goes out for good at midnight," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. I asked him what he wanted, my hands trembling so violently that I had to hide them beneath the ledge of the counter. He didn't answer my question, but instead he began to count down from 60, his eyes never leaving the clock on the wall behind me. I looked at the security monitors, but they were all flickering with static, leaving me completely blind to what might be happening outside or if he had partners waiting in the van. I realized that the bulletproof glass didn't go all the way to the ceiling, and a determined person could easily climb over the top if they had the right leverage. I started to back away toward the small office in the rear, hoping to lock myself in, but I remembered that the spare keys were still hanging on a hook right next to where he was standing. Every second felt like a minute, and the air in the store grew colder as the heating system struggled to stay alive without the main power grid. I wondered if anyone would even drive by this far out on a night like this, or if the snow had blocked the road entirely, leaving me trapped with a man who knew exactly who I was. He reached 30 in his countdown, and his hand went to the heavy bolt cutters hanging from his belt, the metal clinking softly in the silence of the room. I needed to find a way out, but the only other exit was through the storage room, and I knew he had already checked that lock when he first walked in. As the clock reached 10 seconds to midnight, the emergency generator began to cough and sputter, the lights overhead flickering with a dying yellow glow. I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from the desk, my knuckles white, and prepared myself for the moment the world went dark. He reached the end of his countdown, and as the final second ticked over into the new year, the lights gave one last bright flash and then died completely. The store was plunged into a suffocating, pitch-black darkness, and the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots crossing the floor toward my side of the glass. I held my breath, listening for his position, but the sound of the wind outside was so loud that it masked his movements entirely. I fumbled for the exit to the back room, but my hand met the cold, rough fabric of a canvas coat instead of the door handle. He was already behind the counter, moved with a speed that I hadn't anticipated, and I felt his cold fingers brush against my shoulder in the dark. I swung the flashlight with everything I had, feeling it connect with something solid, followed by a grunt of pain and the sound of him stumbling back into a display rack. I didn't wait to see if he was down. I sprinted toward the front door, slipping on the melted snow he had left behind as I scrambled for the handle. The door was jammed from the outside, a heavy chain wrapped through the handles, leaving me locked inside my own workplace while the man recovered in the dark behind me. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, searching for any kind of weapon or a way to break the thick glass of the windows. I could hear him breathing now, a ragged, angry sound that moved steadily through the aisles as he searched for me in the gloom. Why had he chosen me, and was this part of a larger plan, or just the bored cruelty of a man who hunted in the shadows of the holidays? I found a heavy fire extinguisher near the soda fountain and gripped it tight, retreating into the narrow space between the aisles where I could at least see his silhouette against the faint glow of the snow outside. He was standing near the front of the store now, silhouetted by the white storm, and I realized he wasn't just holding bolt cutters anymore. The metallic click of a folding knife snapping open echoed through the room, a sound so sharp and final that it felt like a physical blow. He began to whistle a low, distorted version of Auld Lang Syne, his voice mocking the very idea of a celebration or a fresh start. I knew that if I stayed hidden, he would eventually find me, but if I moved, I risked giving away my position before I was ready to strike. I waited until he was just a few feet away, his shadow stretching long across the floor, and then I pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher. The sudden, violent hiss of the chemical spray filled the air, creating a white cloud that blinded him and gave me the few seconds I needed to move. I didn't run for the door this time. I ran for the office, slamming the heavy wooden door and shoving the filing cabinet against it with a strength born of pure terror. I heard him throw his body against the door, the wood groaning under the impact, but the cabinet held for the moment. I sat on the floor in the dark, clutching the phone that I knew didn't work, listening to him clawing at the wood like an animal. I realized then that the sun wouldn't rise for another 7 hours, and the storm was only getting worse, leaving me in a standoff where the only prize was surviving until morning. I watched the gap under the door, waiting for the light of his flashlight or the sight of his blade, wondering if the first day of the year would also be my last.